No, you know what? He and I talked through like three things.
Ready? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Land Use Committee meeting of May 7th, 2018. I'm Katie Tang, chair of this committee, and somewhere in this room we have Supervisor Asha Safai and Supervisor Jane Kim. Our clerk is Erica Major, and for Massive Gov TV, we'd like to thank Jim Smith and Charles Krimenak. And Madam Clerk, are there any announcements?
Yes, please make sure to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of a file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today will appear on the May 15th Board of Supervisors agenda unless otherwise stated.
Thank you. Can you please call item 1?
Yes, item number 1 is an ordinance amending Division 1 of the Transportation Code to establish a procedure for Board of Supervisors review of certain municipal transportation agency decisions.
Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Supervisor Safai. I know we had to continue this item last week due to amendments, and it looks like you might have more.
No. These are just these are the amendments that were made. I do have one thing I wanted to talk through. I'm glad that the Director of Planning Department is here for the subsequent conversation that we're going to have. But there was an amendment that we made regarding development projects, regarding entitlements, Planning Commission. And the way it was called out was specifically referring, at least in the conversations that we had, was about off-street parking and loading. Is that correct, Director Ram? Okay, so we might add some just clarifying language that talks specifically about Article 1.5 of the Planning Code for off-street parking and loading. We had called it into the record. We want to specifically call that out. So if you would come to the podium, or either Aaron or Director Ram, maybe we can just talk about that for a second. But essentially, I'll call you up in a second, but essentially we made a lot of amendments last week that were removing Class 2 bike way and Class 4 separated bikeways from the process. We had talked about a lot of other amendments that specifically had to do with the fee amounts and the amount of time for review from the clerk, and then finally whether or not something had been noticed in proper time, and then CEQA review. I don't really have any other, we called those amendments into the record last week. So we're very happy about this now. The last little piece that we wanted to talk through maybe for a moment was on development projects that had already had their entitlements and already received their entitlements. And so we were just going to make maybe one clarification as it pertained to parking and off-street parking and loading. Is that what the intent of what you all were trying to convey to us? Director Ram?
Supervisor John Ram, the Planning Department. I was actually here for the second item, and I can't recall the specifics. I believe it was related to parking and off-street loading, and also the kind of the definition of what constitutes an approved development project.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the way that it reads now in the language that we have that's currently in the legislation, it says development project, a project that has already received its land use entitlements from and when those entitlements anticipated subsequent associated applications from the SFMTA, and we called out specifically Planning Commission and Planning Department, and talking to the city attorney and a couple of our colleagues, we might want to clarify that to say a project subject to possible review by the Board of Supervisors or Board of Appeals that has already received its land use entitlements, only when those entitlements anticipated subsequent applications to the SFMTA pursuant to Article 1.5. So we can give you the language and review it. We can read those, we can make that these amendments either today, or we can make them at the full board to give you guys some time to review.
Supervisor, if I may, staff reminds me that I think the issue was more about on-street parking than off-street parking.
Okay, so we had it loading zones,
right,
and then off-street. We had off-street parking and loading. That's what Article 1.5 of the Planning Code refers to. So maybe what we'll do is, hey, Supervisor Peskin. So maybe what I was thinking of doing, since we just had this, we've been kind of going back and forth with some of this language, we can make this final amendment at the full board, or would you prefer to do it right now? Because they haven't had a chance to review this. Through the chair. Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Supervisor Safai and Chair Tang and Vice Chair Kim. I just wanted to apologize for being a little bit late and thank Supervisor Safai and his staff and my staff for working on this. I think, and I'm sorry I missed the first few minutes of the meeting, but I think at a high level what is very important about the changes that we made at our last meeting is the fact that only 5 supervisors can ultimately bring an appeal. So there is an aspect of self-regulation here, and I think in the instance of the exemption for development project as defined, that, and I don't want to sound conspiratorial, but that perhaps, no disrespect to the SFMTA or their future leaders and infrastructure, that we could end up with a scenario where people or agencies try to incorporate exceptions relative to this, and I don't really think that that game should be played. So, I mean, for my money, I would just take this definition out, but I concur with Supervisor Safai that I think what drives this are some code mandates that we all agree with, and primarily they are in 1.5. So I think there's language that we could do. I could offer that language today, but again, I think it should all be seen under the general heading of the board's, the board will self-regulate. And I think what's very important is that we all acknowledge that 11 years later, this is an experiment, and to the extent that it's needed, I will, because I will, short of passing away untimely, be here, and together with Supervisor Safai, would want to call a hearing about this in a year to make sure that we're achieving the priorities of the board and continuing the collaborative relationship. This is not with you, Mr. Ram, but with the SFMTA. But the language that I would propose, whether it's at this meeting or at the full board, is something along the lines of changing the definition of a development project to a project subsequent to possible review by the Board of Supervisors or Board of Appeals that has received its land use entitlements only when those entitlements required an application to the SFMTA pursuant to Article 1.5 of the Planning Code. In other words, it's only where a code requirement was triggered that there would be an exception.
Right.
But I'm happy, I'll defer to the chief sponsor as to whether or not we should make that today or at the full Board of Supervisors next week.
So my just because we haven't had an opportunity to have them review it, so I would prefer, Director Ram, that we give you this language, and we're letting you know that we're anticipating making this amendment, but we want to give you the opportunity to review it, and then most likely we're going to make this amendment at the full board. So we'll give you some time to review it.
That would be helpful. I appreciate that. Thank you.
And then the only other thing I wanted to make sure, Deputy City Attorney Givner, if we put in the 5, you mentioned one other thing. We put in the 5 threshold. Oh, did we write the language in that allows us the opportunity to come back and for there to be a report from the SFMTA, so they would give us an update on this?
Deputy City Attorney John Givner, no, that was not part of the amendments that were made last week. There was some talk about a potential sunset, making it a pilot. You could add in a reporting requirement. A member of the board could just ask for a hearing on it a year from now.
That's
either
fine.
way.
We'll just do that. We'll ask for a hearing at that time. So I don't have any other comments. I mean, we made all of our comments last week. I think we've gotten feedback. I think we're ready to vote on this, or as soon as public comment is over. But we will give you a copy of this language, Director Ram and your team, and then we'll make that final amendment on Tuesday.
Okay, thank you. So Supervisor Peskin?
And Chair Tang, again, I apologize for being a few minutes late, but I just wanted to make sure that the amendments suggested by the clerk of the board were...
We talked about...
Excellent.
Oh, you might want to talk. I kind of brushed over them, but if you want to go on...
I just wanted to make sure that
feedback?
the clerk of the board suggested a number of amendments, and I wanted to just make sure that those amendments have been made by a committee member.
Why don't you go ahead and... I talked about, but I thought those were mainly the ones that we talked about last week. So why don't you talk about
So I believe this all falls in and around the filing fee requirements, which I think initially we wanted to waive entirely.
Right.
And subsequently, Ms. Samara and our clerk, Ms. Calvillo, suggested some language which is primarily, but not solely, incorporated at page 7 at the top at line 1, subsection H, filing fee waiver, which conforms with the planning code provisions. Mr. Deputy City Attorney, are you looking at me because you don't have any idea of what I'm talking about, or because you do?
I do. In addition to the filing fee amendment, the clerk's office also worked with your offices to come up with some timing changes throughout pages 4 and 5 of the ordinance.
Right. And so that would be on page 5 in 2 places at line 12. Any filing fee paid shall be returned to the requester. And line 24, otherwise requested notice at least 10 calendar days prior to the scheduled hearing. Also on page 4 at line 3, that language that says within 30 calendar days. At line 22 on the same page, page 4, and accompanied by a filing fee in the amount of $250 payable to the clerk of the Board of Supervisors. Contrary to our discussions at the last meeting, those would take precedent, and if a member of the committee could make those changes, I would be grateful.
Right. So I make a motion to accept these changes as proposed?
Okay.
Through the chair,
Oh, we
haven't
have to
taken
do it
a-
after public comment. Okay.
All right.
Right.
So
And if I can just say one other thing, just for clarity for the public and those listening, is that the main purpose of this is that we, members of the Board of Supervisors, just for everyone's memory, we have to act on and move on any appeal of a decision within 60 days. So that's essentially what Supervisor Peskin was clarifying, that we worked out with the clerk, the process by which we would meet those deadlines and have appropriate time to review at the Board of Supervisors. Thank you. Thank you, Chair Tang.
And Madam Chair, not to put too fine a point on it, but I just do want to reiterate the words that we uttered and discussed last week, which is, I think, to a large extent, the notion of re-involving the legislative branch that ceded its powers 11 years ago in the process is already working, for which I want to extend thanks and acknowledgement to the SFMTA and its leadership.
All right, thank you. So at this time, we'll go to public comment on item 1. I have a couple of comment cards: Eileen Boken, Maria Liza, Matt Brazima, Jody Menderos, and Theodore Randolph. Please come on up. And if I didn't call your name, just please line on up.
Good afternoon, supervisors. Mary Eliza here. And I just want to, first of all, thank you for bringing this ordinance forward. The lack of trust in the SFMTA is growing amid the gridlock and unfinished projects and constant bad contract decisions that are following a set of policies and procedures that the public does not understand and does not really know anything about. That is why you're getting all the complaints that you're getting, because the public really doesn't know exactly how this whole thing works anyway. And thank you for expressing some of the information that you've been bringing forward during this hearing. And I just want to say a couple of things. I sent emails out earlier, and I just want to get them on the public record, that are problems that the public is having. One of them is there's no direct email contact with the individual directors of the MTA board, and there's no ability for the public to interact with them. And this leads to the level of distrust that's already there. The other thing I want to mention is that the board meetings have been conducted in such a manner that does not invite public participation and is actually also creating quite a bit of anger among members of the public that attempt to deal with the board. And we're hoping that these kind of actions on your part will change some of that. So I believe unless the issues are addressed, and the board and the staff actually starts following what the board tells it to do. We're finding areas where the staff is not following board's direction, that this matter will not be cleared up with this particular ordinance, but we're hoping that it will work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hi, Matt Brzezina, the People Protected Bike Lane. I don't spend a lot of time looking at legislation, but I do spend a lot of time studying our dangerous streets. And I'm worried about any type of legislation that slows the transition of our high injury network to be a safe street network. And so if adding a stop sign is going to make a street like Howard more safe, I don't think we should add 60 days of additional bureaucracy, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, while more people get injured and killed on those streets. So I would encourage you to exempt high injury network streets from this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Bob Feinbaum. I'm the chair of Save Muni. We are supportive of this legislation, but I want to second Supervisor Peskin's thought that the fee for appeals should be zero. I understand there may be some technical issues with that, but I would suggest if you can lower the fee and increase the breadth of the exemptions, that would be a very good idea. Secondly, 5 supervisors seems to me to be a fairly strenuous lift to get one of these hearings. I don't know why you moved from 4 to 5, but I would support lowering the number of supervisors that are required for this measure. We think this is a good first step, but obviously, in our opinion, the SFMTA needs decided structural changes that we hope will be forthcoming in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could just make 2 comments, which is that number one, the 5 supervisor threshold mirrors the 5 supervisor threshold, as you noted when you suggested the amendment at our last meeting for conditional use appeals under the planning code. And as I stated earlier with regard to the fee waiver provisions, we have incorporated at page 7, subsection H, the same provisions that exist in the planning code, which is that fee waivers apply to a neighborhood organization that has been in existence for 24 months prior to the filing date for the request for review, or is on the planning department's neighborhood notification list, and an indigent person who attests to his or her ability to not be able to pay the filing fee.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, supervisors. Hello, my name is Jody Medeiros, and I'm the executive director of Walk San Francisco. I'm back again this week to continue to ask you to exempt the high injury network from this ordinance. The high injury network is a specific map of streets that SFMTA will be working on the next 5 years to achieve Vision Zero. We know the SFMTA must often remove or modify parking to install important Vision Zero safety, and this appeal process could stall our progress when lives are at stake, and it's at a time when we need projects to move faster for Vision Zero to achieve Vision Zero. Thankfully, last week, you modified the ordinance to rightfully exempt bike lanes, but you still don't exempt high injury network or transit projects. And this honestly doesn't make any sense. The SFMTA looks at safety holistically. We can take, for example, Upper Market Street. That is a bike project, a pedestrian project, and a transportation project. And it's also on the high injury network. Again, I urge you to amend the ordinance to exempt projects on the high injury network as well as transit projects, because we can't be looking at safety piece by piece. Vision Zero honestly needs champions and some bold action to achieve it, and I hope you'll stand by your Vision Zero, making sure this ordinance does not slow down our progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, supervisors. I'm Alice Rogers. I'm president of the South Beach Rincon Mission Bay Neighborhood Association, and I'm here on behalf of our board and the entire membership of our association to join with WAC SF in asking you that you exempt the high entry corridors from this legislation as well as transit projects. We feel in our neighborhood that actually outreach has been good and increasingly good over time. We also understand that it's our obligation as a community group to help extend that outreach and to make sure as many neighbors as possible know about these projects and can weigh in. We think that process is working. As an individual, I've dabbled a little bit in public realm, in parklets and a few intersections here and there, and I know personally that parking spaces are just the third rail. And I really think that the Board of Supervisors has many, many, many more important issues to deal with. So please exempt the higher entry corridor. Don't slow down the progress on Vision Zero or transit projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Hello, I'm Theodore Randolph. I live in the Excelsior, and I grew up a few blocks away from where Safai lives. My brother was a grade below Katie Tang at Lowell. And I think our districts have too much parking. There's, we see, my office now is near the 101 entrance. There's backed up cars most of the day, every day, and there are cars backed up going to the freeway because there are parking spots on the other side. And actually, in the Sunset and in the Excelsior, a lot of the parking spots are illegal. People are parking on the sidewalk. So we really need to have much less parking. Let's see. And I also think we should abandon this particular project, this particular legislation entirely, because if we want to get rid of the parking, we need to have the getting rid of parking be equitable in an equitable fashion and tailored according to the needs of the community. And so like my brother went to Lowell, he took bus from Excelsior to Sunset. And we need a lot more people to be taking buses. So I think the way that the SFMTA has ability to do projects is a pretty good way to try things out, to reverse small projects. Try small projects, reverse them if they don't work well. They got a glowing review in the Institute for Transportation Engineers last year because of the freedom from all the extra hearings, they were able to do in 10% of the time and 25% of the cost. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Peter Strauss. I'm on the board of the San Francisco Transit Riders. I'll be brief because you've heard extensively from Rachel Hayden, RED, at your previous meeting, and I think you've also heard directly from a number of our members. Let me say I do appreciate what you've done in the last revisions to raise the thresholds on the appeals to 5 and exempt the petitions. We're very supportive of that change. I do want to, as other speakers have, ask you to reconsider two classes of exemptions that are currently not defined. One is the high injury network, specifically to help the city to achieve its Vision Zero goals. And secondly, that you exempt transit priority projects as well. Transit reliability is the most important concern of transit riders these days, and improving transit reliability is achieved through small projects, not huge projects on the street every day. And it's these transit priority projects that we're asking you consider exempting from these appeals. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And before the last speaker, if there's anyone else whose name I didn't call, just please line on up. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Arielle Fleischer, and I'm a Transportation Policy Associate with Spur. Like the others who have spoken today, we appreciate the changes that have been made to the appeals legislation from last week to this. We also echo the concerns that were made by others today that the appeals legislation does not include exemptions for projects along the high injury network and also transit priority projects. We think this is a mistake, and these projects should also be exempt from review. The SFMTA needs to be able to act with speed and independence to achieve Vision Zero and also to improve transit and make it easier for people to walk and bike. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
I'm Paula Katz with the community group Save Our El Taravel Stops. I support this ordinance because it's about time the Board of Supervisors exercised the authority long ago granted by the voters to create a procedure to review certain SFMTA decisions. I would support a fee waiver for all residents because it's very hard for individuals to raise raise money for this, and we still want their participation, and I oppose the additional exemptions that other people have urged. We organized our neighbors to join with the Taravel Street merchants to work with MTA on planning and implementing the El Taravel Rapid Project. Our experience is that MTA is just too big and self-empowered to actually change many of their predetermined plans by accommodating input from the people they are meant to serve. The Parkside District and other communities throughout the city are not the same as downtown Market Street, and MTA's one-size-fits-all toolbox of so-called improvements that they force on many communities just doesn't fit. MTA does not have any outside entity over them, so they don't have to be responsive to the public, and there is no way for us to appeal their bad decisions. This ordinance is a great first step in changing that, and we are very glad that you're working on it. I also urge you in the future to try to amend the charter to allow the Board of Supervisors to review other MTA decisions, including the removal of Muni stops. If not for the intervention of Supervisor Yee, who came up with a last-minute compromise, MTA staff probably would be recommending for the third time over massive opposition that our local community Safeway stop be removed to save 20 seconds. They say they want more people to ride Muni, but reduce service by removing stops instead of coming up with better ways to speed up the lines. And Board of Supervisor review of those decisions would be helpful. But that's in the future. This ordinance is a great beginning, and I urge you to approve it.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Hi, my name's Otto Duffy. I commute by way of BMW, BART, Muni, Walk. The MTA it's a wart on the face of civil governance. It's politically obtuse. They're trying to do more than one thing, somehow get traffic to mitigate all the rest of the harms of overly dense planning. You know, it's not going to work. I'm glad that somebody's finally addressing this issue. I live in fear of what's going to happen on Taylor Street, Lower Taylor Street here near the City Hall, which has a relatively high traffic capacity at the moment, and which basically is the gateway to Chinatown, which, you know, what's going to happen to business in Chinatown if that gets closed down. And also, you look at the new streetcars, the seating plan. How are you, with hard bench seats and not enough of them, how are you going to convince the Uber people to sit in those seats? That's ridiculous.
Thank you. Next speaker, please, and any other members of the public on item 1.
Eileen Boken to speak here on my own behalf. Although I really wanted to go to the ballot, I am willing to support this legislation. It is definitely long overdue. It establishes checks and balances, which are a basic tenet of this country. Even though the legislation does not apply to prior decisions, as a sign of good faith, I would strongly urge the MTA and its board to reevaluate the following. Citywide, decisions regarding emerging transportation technologies. On the west side, transit-only lanes on Taravel, as after 1 year there is clearly no demonstrated purpose and need. I would strongly urge the MTA and its board to approve their removal. As for concrete boarding islands on Taravel, I would strongly urge the MTA and its board to modify specifications and instead install more flexible and innovative alternative. There are modular and eco-friendly boarding islands currently on the market. Los Angeles Transit has already installed one. You should also have received an email from the president of the Terraville Parkside Merchants, also known as POPs, on other transit Terraville-related issues, and I would oppose any exemptions being proposed today to the legislation.
Thank you very much for those comments. And any other members of the public who wish to speak on item 1? Okay, seeing none, public comments closed. Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Chair Tang and sponsor Safai. I just wanted to say a couple of overarching things, which is if you're sitting here, particularly if you were the author of Proposition A, which ceded the board's historic authority over the MTA directly to what's almost a parallel body that has the same legislative powers as the Board of Supervisors who are elected. And you saw the experiment roll out for a decade. I remind everybody that Prop A actually expressly included a provision that the board could take matters up on appeal. And the way Supervisor Safai and I crafted this is, again, very narrow and narrowly tailored. And the amendments that have been made that actually, contrary to some of the public comment that we hear today, do not allow, as originally intended, members of the public to bring this, but can only be initiated by a member of the public, whether it's an individual or individuals or an organization, and then requires 5 supervisors to sign on. I think is very healthy because it's going to build a modicum of public trust in the entire system. So let's try this experiment out for a year. To the SFMTA, I think it is very important, and I'm looking at Sarah B. Jones, who hails from the planning department, so her and Mr. Ram and Mr. Starr and others can collaborate, which is that the planning department, I think, has done a very good job over time in its public noticing to let the public know where and when their opportunities to initiate are. So for you, that is going to be in the Transportation Code Division 2 at Section 203, which I think is going to require some work to make sure that the public is informed, that notifications include very clear language, like you see on the notices that neighbors get and we as members of the Board of Supervisors get that say this decision is or is not subject to review by the Board of Supervisors through the certain process. And I think it's also very important that Section 203, which is again under your commission's legislative jurisdiction, be very clear as to what is a final decision that somebody can then petition 5 members of the board to sign. So I just wanted to put that on the record. And then finally, this is really, I think, a housekeeping issue and maybe is for the MTA to answer, but I think there may just be a little bit of redundant language, which is bicycle lane is defined as a Class 2 bikeway or Class 4 separated bikeway or cycle track. And then subsequently, the provision that defines a final SFMTA decision includes creating or eliminating a Class 3 bikeway or bike route. I think a cycle track, but correct me if I'm wrong, is a Class 3. So this may be redundant. You may have staff here, but I think that we are saying the same thing, which is that Class 2, 3, and 4 bikeways are excluded.
Okay, that's fine.
So that, just for Chair Tang, would be page 1, line 18, the definition of bicycle lane, and page 2, line 5, creating or eliminating Class 2 bikeway or bike route.
Okay, we have Ms. Sarah Jones here.
Yes, Sarah Jones, Planning Director from the SFMTA. I am not the resident expert on the design features of different types of bicycle ways. My understanding, and I'm going to ask Brian Wiedemeyer of the Bicycle Coalition to come up to clarify, but my understanding is that the idea was to specifically call out discrete bicycle lanes rather than what we term sharrows, which are a street that's just shared with bicycle facilities. But I'm going to let Brian speak to that as well.
I was trying to exempt them all, but go ahead.
Chair Tang, supervisors, thank you. Yeah, this is the NACTO guidelines, and it's very confusing, but a Class 2 or Class 4 cycle track or bikeway are what you see painted on the street or a fully separated protected bike lane. The idea here with not exempting Class 3 bikeways is that we feel that they are substandard. They offer no physical protection. They are just paint on the ground. And so should the SFMTA water down a project, we would actually encourage the Board of Supervisors to review that on appeal.
Thank you. I will leave that issue alone. Right. Thank you for elucidating that. And you actually, Mr. Wiedemeyer, said something that's very important, which is the right of appeal goes both ways.
That's right.
Okay. Supervisor Safai?
Yeah, I just want to say some closing remarks. I really appreciate all the hard work from Supervisor Peskin's office in collaborating on this issue and actually engaging on something that he's dedicated a good portion of his legislative career to getting right. And I think that the point of where we are right now today is that there are aspects of what we have seen over the last 10 years that people are very happy with and are moving forward in a good manner. And we all, and I just want to say for the record, Vision Zero, pedestrian safety, on-time performance of Muni, all of those issues I think have been moving in the right direction. But there are a very loud and vocal, I would say majority, that are upset about certain aspects of the decisions that have been made and the manner in which they've been made. And I think that was a really important point that Supervisor Peskin and I have talked a lot about on the record and in community meetings and meetings with stakeholders, that there needs to be a more formalized process for which the SFMTA must follow for its public noticing and for its way of notifying people how decisions are and the process by which members of the community and public can influence those decisions before they become final. And I think that's, in many ways, a part of what we're trying to do, along with additional oversight, along with separation of powers, along with having some level of review at this board, which I don't think is a bad thing. I mean, we sit as commissioners on the Transportation Authority. We review every single project that is funded by the gas tax and Prop K money. So we already do have review, but then we've created this additional process by which members of the Board of Trustees or directors of the SFMTA, as Supervisor said, have a very similar legislative power, but don't have that level of review that we do as elected officials. And I think that this is a step. This is also going to be an experiment. We have seen some changes in SFMTA's behavior. All of my colleagues have come to me and said that the way in which SFMTA is behaving and interacting with members of the Board of Supervisors has changed since we put forward our charter amendment. And I think that's a positive thing. We're going to have more flow of information with staffing. We're going to have, with staff, we're going to have more involvement in understanding the community process by which projects are noticed. And I think that's all a positive thing. And I think that's what a lot of members of the public are looking for. And I will say, you know, people do want to be involved in the smaller neighborhood projects that revolve around predominantly pedestrian safety and traffic calming and Vision Zero issues. So, and one point to clarify, this does not slow down the decision making. We have 60 days to act if we intend to review a project, and that's 5 members of the Board of Supervisors, but that does not slow down in any way. The only way it would is if we actually decided to engage on appeal, and using the example that Supervisor Peskin used before on the CU process, I've been on the board for 1.5 years, and we've done that twice on 2 projects. So again, I think that this is not going to impede the progress that we've made over the last decade in any way, shape, or form. And I'm very happy to send this to the full board. We will come back. I have heard from the planning department on clarifying the language. I think that what we are proposing, Deputy City Attorney Givner, will not slow down the review in any way. Is this going out as a committee report, or is this going out to the board next week?
Next week.
Okay, so we have time to get the language right, but planning supervisor is in general in favor of citing the section of the code, whether it's the transportation code or planning code, and we will refine that over the next week and introduce it at the board on Tuesday. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Supervisor Kim.
I just wanted to add a few words, having heard this last week and this week. I, like some of the members of the public, was a little concerned about what this might do to many of the projects that we've prioritized around Vision Zero. I think that the change of permitting only 5 members of the board to appeal does change how my support for this. When we originally included a neighborhood appeal process, I was incredibly concerned because I know that that would put a lot of our Vision Zero projects potentially on the line and of course would lead to many delays. But I am in agreement to pilot this for a year and to see what the outcomes of it are. I do want to support stronger communication relationships with SFMTA and this board. I do want to reiterate, though, last week I had said that I have felt like I had a good communication relationship with SFMTA, and so this has not been my experience. Many of the projects that I've been working on with SFMTA have moved through. The only thing that I would add was two things. One was figuring out how we can do residential permits in multi-use neighborhoods that are both commercial and residential, which I know that MTA has been reluctant to do, but I think in many ways this will be the future of San Francisco neighborhoods, is that we are going to see more mixed-use neighborhoods. And while not everyone should drive and park, I think that's we should be thoughtful about that as we move forward. And then finally, I think part of the reason why we have been able to get many of the Vision Zero projects that our office has been pushing and the neighborhood has been pushing have unfortunately been byproducts of actual fatalities in the district that I represent. And I just hope that as we move forward on Vision Zero, that we're not motivated by the news of a fatality, but that we can, based on data, move forward on many of these Vision Zero projects where we have identified corridors. So I think over the next year, let's see how this process goes. I have a lot more faith in it, knowing that 5 members of the board will it will be in the hands of 5 members of the board to appeal these projects. But at the end of the day, I do think it's important to strengthen communication and relationships between the department and the Board of Supervisors, so I will be supporting this.
Thank you very much. And I made most of my comments last week as well, but I think there are a lot of other issues we have to address with the agency, but I think that I am willing to give this legislation a go and to experiment with it as well for potentially a year or so. But yes, I'd love a reevaluation. Okay, so with that said, Supervisor Safai had some amendments,
yes.
Additional amendments.
So nothing additional other than what we read into the record. So we will make that final amendment with planning over the next week. But
okay.
So I make a motion to accept all of the amendments as proposed with regard to fees and.
Okay, we will do that without objection, and then as amended on the full legislation.
Send it to the full board with positive recommendation.
Okay, and we will do that without objection as well. All right.
Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, Madam Clerk, item 2, please.
Item number 2 is an ordinance amending the planning code to increase the transportation sustainability fee by $5 for non-residential projects.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to the sponsor, Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Madam Chair, for hearing this item. Even after, no offense, Mr. Ram, the planning department, I believe, dropped the ball and missed the generous 3-month window of time allowed under the charter to bring it before the Planning Commission, even though we had several meetings with them to plan for the item and entertain staff thoughts on the policy, and were originally told the item would be heard a month ago on April 12th, and then were later asked if we could move it to April 19th. And then later told after the debacle with another items notice, namely the Central Soma plan, that our item has been pushed out, actually without mine or my staff's knowledge, to May the 17th. And so here we are. This item is properly before this committee and the Board of Supervisors pursuant to the charter. And I've been looking forward to having this conversation for a couple of years because I think it's one that is long overdue. We have been a transit-first city for over a generation, and yet the responsibility to put forward a thoughtful long-term plan for maintaining our existing transportation network and expanding it to accommodate the city's booming residential and private sector job growth has fallen short. While we have intentionally expedited projects that have added thousands of bodies to the city's workforce, corresponding transit improvements continue to fall behind. A couple of years ago, in 2016, voters let us know exactly how they felt about how we were doing on that job when they overwhelmingly approved Proposition J's transportation expenditure plan, and at the exact same time, by a 2-to-1 margin, voted down Prop K's sales tax revenue source by roughly the same amount of votes. The message, I think, was clear. We can all agree that transportation infrastructure is an unmet need in San Francisco, but we want to make sure that those who are causing the most impact to the system pay their fair share to build it out and to maintain it and operate it. And we're not the only city that has woken up to this reality. As a matter of fact, I think we woke up to it very early on with jobs, housing linkage, and other things. Other metropolitan areas from New York City to Seattle have come to similar conclusions. If you want to build massive amounts of office space, you must contribute to transportation infrastructure citywide, particularly, and I say this because it's been stuck in my craw for a while, as we have given tax breaks for commercial property owners gifted by the Trump administration. Bottom line is you got to pay for it. If you want it, you got to pay for it. On March 1st of 2016, the board passed then Supervisor John Avalos' transportation sustainability fee by a slim 6-to-5 vote. Supervisor Kim and I voted to pass it with the acknowledgement that an increase to the citywide fee was necessary to ensure that growth anywhere in the city was mitigated everywhere in the city. The TSF replaced what was around in my day, was actually started by then Supervisor, or she may have been mayor at the time, Dianne Feinstein, called the Transportation Impact Development Fee, TIDF, and ensured that it applied to not only commercial but to residential projects, where the TIDF originally only applied to commercial, really office in the C3 and in a few places outside of the downtown core. After an exhaustive battle to reform our inclusionary housing laws, which many, actually all of the members of this committee worked on, particularly Supervisors Kim and later Safai, I decided not to pursue a residential increase, but focus on the commercial side. And that is what is before you today. Planning subsequently did 2 separate analyses, including a feasibility as well as a nexus study, and the commission heard those findings last summer. As you all know, in your incarnation as members of the County Transportation Authority, I co-chaired, along with Mayor Lee, a 6-month-long process to identify new revenue for the city's unmet transit needs. It was facilitated by the Comptroller's Office, and very well so, and included a really amazing diversity of stakeholders from every supervisorial district as well as almost every single city department and regional transportation agency, including the planning department and, of course, our own SFMTA. It was data-driven and exhaustive, and many of our constituents gave hours of their time without compensation to put forth a thorough list of recommendations that all 11 members of the County Transportation Authority Board reviewed and signed off on. The Transportation Task Force 2045 identified an astonishing $22 billion in need for transportation infrastructure and operations over the next 27 years, with the approved expenditure plan outlined in Prop J, which was already behind schedule. Our local contribution, actually, I should say our second local contribution, because the voters of San Francisco generously voted a $500 million general obligation bond paid for by property owners and in many cases passed through to tenants. And subsequently, we all agreed, Mayor Lee and the board, that we needed to find a additional local source of revenue in the amount of $100 million annually. In December of last year, I introduced what I thought was a reasonable gross receipts tax measure that would have applied a modest increase to commercial revenues from office rents after working with the Comptroller's Office and the TTF 2045 members, the Treasurer and Tax Collector, and the City Attorney. That was thoroughly vetted and garnered the most overall votes from the TTF 2045 task force members. And here we are today with no ill will or offense to my colleagues on this panel. Some of them chose to pursue a absolutely laudable measure for child care. Others chose to pursue an equally laudable measure for housing, and the source of revenue for transportation has thus far been left on the cutting room floor. So, colleagues, in your incarnation as members of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority and as members of the Board of Supervisors, all of whom in both of their incarnations have a duty to deal with our monumental transportation obligations in this transit-first city, I have been thinking about ways to reduce that $100 million nut. And one of them, as Chair Tang knows, is to go back to the TSF increase, which planning and its studies have showed are feasible and will not stop development. Now, because, and remember, when we considered this in 2016, and I acknowledge that Supervisor Tang voted for that legislation, which Mayor Lee vetoed. I acknowledge that Supervisor Kim voted for it when Supervisor Tang voted against it, and that Supervisor Safai was not a member of the Board of Supervisors. We have an opportunity to reduce that $100 million a year going forward. Had this been passed or not vetoed, then this fee would have been in place. And I know that the current conversation is we have, or I should say, had this been heard in April by the Planning Commission, had the scheduling screw-up not happened once, twice, but 3 times, it would have been before us some time ago. All of that is water under the bridge or over the dam. And I acknowledge that now Central Soma will be here in late June, and there is concern that given the, what I believe is appropriate level of fees and fee structures for Central Soma, there is concern that this will make development in Central Soma less than feasible. I differ with those concerns, but will ask the committee, and we'll pass out to you shortly, an amendment to reduce the $5 increase to the TSF in Central Soma, where there are some 30 projects that would be impacted, to a mere $2, as was considered in Supervisor Avalos' legislation in 2016. Planning's May 2015 Nexus study shows that commercial developments generate almost 3 times the impacts on our transportation system as residential developments do. Commercial properties got off pretty well in the TSF discussion last go-around, though Supervisor Avalos tried valiantly, as I discussed, to increase the commercial fee by $2 to make up the gap prior to the veto. And by the way, all of this should be seen in light of the very real and massive hole that may be blown into our budget if SB 1 is repealed. So from the transportation side, I wanted to put that on the table. All of these discussions have been very well known to the development community. who were involved in countless hearings and city meetings on both the nexus and feasibility studies as well as the TTF 2045. And had the mayor not vetoed Supervisor Avalos' legislation, commercial fees for properties over 100,000 square feet. So that is, let's put this in perspective. These are office developments of over 100,000 square feet would actually be $21.04, a modest $2 increase, which is the same recommendation put forward by the task force. I'm going to wind it down here, but I do want to quibble with a few things. Planning staff calculated the cumulative impact on LRV for childcare impact because that was pending, residual land value, and a range of potential values for the transit sustainability fee from the currently proposed $19.04 up to a $5 increase to $24.04. The department's own analysis, Mr. Ram, found that when Supervisor Avalos' proposed $2 increase in the large non-residential TSF would be combined with Supervisor Yee's then pending child care fee, the impact on residual land value is only minus 7%, which is below or well below the minus 10% threshold for a project's fiscal feasibility. It also showed that the $5 increase to the TSF would still be considered economically feasible, which is why I opted to start there for the TSF increase because I don't want to leave any money on the table. According to the Central SOMA feasibility study, which I know planning will speak to, planning assumed a 7% rent increase in commercial rent over the 2-year span between 2015 and 2017. And I would really like to fact check that and hear from planning on where they're getting these projected rent prices and how they calculated them, particularly given that the data is coming from Jones Lang LaSalle, who are the same firm that the controller has been using in its commercial real estate scorecard, where they projected a 12% increase. So I'm not exactly sure how Jones LaSalle can give 12% to Ben Rosenfeld and 7% to the planning department. We all know that office rents are going for an all-time premium, and I work with commercial property owners all the time, given that I am the downtown supervisor, or actually nowadays half the downtown supervisor, given that half of downtown is shifted into Supervisor Kim's district, who can testify to the fact that we are fully leased before these projects even come online. So it's odd to me that the planning department is presuming a 10% vacancy rate. Most of the large footprint, 100,000 square foot plus spaces are highly desirable, and they will have an impact on the rest of the city, whether you are in the Sunset or the Excelsior or the Richmond. So with that, I will hand to you, colleagues, my amendment, which I spoke to, which would be a $5 increase, except for in the Central SOMA, which would be a $2 increase, and look forward to hearing your comments in the presentation from planning and the SFMTA.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Supervisor Kim first, and then I do know we have a number of representatives from the departments that we do want to hear from and probably have a lot of questions for. Supervisor Kim?
Great. And I know that this wasn't able to be scheduled at the Planning Commission, but I did read through the planning staff report. Initially, actually, I was open to moving forward the $5 increase outside of the Central SOMA plan because I had originally supported this 2 years ago, but I know that the vast majority of projects that will be impacted by the increase are within the Central SOMA plan. So I do want to have a discussion about that. And so Moses Kret from my office did give me financial analysis results that the planning department did this morning or recently. And so I was hoping to get a presentation. Now, I know this is a conservative analysis, but I do think it's still helpful to walk through if that's okay. And I think Supervisor Tang or Chair Tang would like to I don't know if you want to make comments first.
It's okay. I think after we hear from maybe Director Ram first, one of my overarching questions is just that I know I've been hearing a lot of reference to a feasibility study, nexus study. I'm not sure which year, if it was a 2015 one or if there's something that was done more recently. I'd love to have a little bit more clarity around what we're all looking at. But I do have the Central SOMA one at least in front of me. But I just wanted clarity around what numbers we're all referring to from which report, which study, which year. That would be great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Supervisors. Again, John Ram for the Planning Department. First, I just want to say that it is true that it was, and I will take responsibility for our noticing error that prevented this from going to the Planning Commission on April 12th. It was the same noticing error that prevented the Central SOMA plan from being heard earlier. So I would take responsibility for that. Having said that, I would like the committee to consider a continuance until after the Planning Commission hearing next week. It's a mere 10 days from now. Would on May 17th, a week from Thursday, right? Having said that, I'm joined today by Aaron Starr from my staff, Sarah Jones from the SFMTA, and Lisa Chen, who actually is responsible for that financial analysis. The one thing I just wanted to mention, and Lisa can get into more of the details of that financial analysis, is that we do have a very serious concern about feasibility with Central SOMA projects. I fully understand the goal of this legislation. I fully understand the need to fund our transit systems. And when we were doing the financial analysis for Central SOMA, we were trying to find a very narrow sweet spot between feasibility and maximizing public benefits. We did that financial analysis initially, I think 3 years ago in 2015. We have redone that analysis this year, recognizing the very substantial increase in construction costs over the last 3 years. And we are very concerned that an increase in the TSF will make these projects infeasible. I understand the goal, and I'm not arguing with the goal of funding transit. I'm just very concerned about that sweet spot being lost in this process. And I would also remind you that because of the community facilities district that we are proposing in the Central SOMA plan, the Mello-Roos, if you will, that we are generating $500 million in the Central SOMA plan over 25 years for transportation improvements. So there are certainly, the large projects in that neighborhood are certainly on the hook to actually fund a lot of transportation improvements, even as currently proposed. But with that, maybe I'll ask Sarah Jones to come up, and then Lisa Chen from the Planning Department to talk about feasibility or whatever you want to do.
Supervisor Preston, did you have a question in the meantime?
Well, I was hoping to go through this.
I think Lisa's the author of that and can speak to that in more detail.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Supervisor
It's not really a question so much as it is, and I'm not being argumentative, but this kind of reminds me about where a developer of a large project, whether it's Mission Bay or the shipyard or Pier 70 or Treasure Island, come forward and they say, here is our pro forma for a 30-year build-out time horizon, wherein we acknowledge that markets cycle up and cycle down, and then a market cycles down, they come back 24, 36, or 48 months later, say, oh my God, the sky has fallen, we need to renegotiate the deal. So when, in May of 2015, in one of the most robust economic environments, yes, with land values escalating and cost of construction escalating, the Transit Sustainability Fee Nexus study was issued and actually showed a maximum justified transit capital facilities fee of $25.63 a square foot. And what I am proposing is $24.04 a square foot. And we can talk about Central SOMA. It still seems to me that there is some leeway there. And to say, oh, we've come back 3 years later and this factoid has increased is not the long-term time horizon. We all know that whether it's 24 months or 36 months, this current economic environment will cycle the other way. We've seen it. Hey, listen, I was on the board during the Great Recession. I was on the board during SARS. I mean, I've seen us have healthy, well,
SARS?
the combination of SARS, colleagues, combined with September 11th, led to a period of economic instability in San Francisco and other municipalities in the western seaboard of the United States. And I was on the board in 2002 when we had massive budget cuts, the likes of which I look forward to again. But at any rate, my point is that it's problematic to me when we do a nexus study, spend a bunch of money on it, say the maximum square foot feasible fee is north of $25.50, and then come back 3 years later and say it's more expensive to build stuff now. I just want, and you're welcome to respond to it.
No, I'm sorry, I don't want to enter a debate. I just want, I think we all know that there's a difference between a nexus study and a feasibility study. And I think, the nexus studies often will create an impact that is beyond what is actually feasible. And that's been the case with all of our impact fees over the years. So, I just want to reiterate, we are trying to find that sweet spot for Central Soma. I'm not arguing whether developers should pay their fair share. It's only what that number is and how to make projects feasible.
And then, quick question, just to build on that. So, I think Supervisor Peskin is referring to Table 4.7 on page 34 of that 2015 Nexus study, where he references the $25.63. Did that take into account sort of any of the other, or would that be in the feasibility study, where you would take into account all the different other fees that would be layered on as a result of Central Soma?
It would be the latter.
Different. That would be okay.
That would be the feasibility study, right? Okay. Well, if I can, maybe I can ask Lisa Chen to come up and give you some of the more finer detail on that.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Lisa Chen of Department Staff. If I could get the overhead. So I believe that a number of you have already seen this latest update that the department has created for our feasibility analysis, specifically in Central Soma. I also have a handout describing kind of a quick analysis we did of the original TSF financial feasibility analysis that I can go over as well. But just to reiterate, what John Raham said, we're really striving to maximize the value capture in this area. So just to give a sense of how we often do this for our area plans, we calculate what all of the needs are, what the public benefits are, and then we calculate how much we believe development can bear. And then we also calculate how much value we're creating through the upzoning, and then we're trying to capture a certain amount. So in this case, we're trying to capture between 50 to 75% of the value that's being created by the Central Soma upzoning. So that's what these numbers are showing in the kind of pastel colors. So the green is kind of right in that sweet spot of 50 to 75% value capture. The pink is kind of the more marginal 75 to 100% value capture, and then the pink is showing prototypes that are no longer feasible after we apply the various exactions. So the first line that I want to point out in green, this is referring to kind of the level that we had set back in 2015. This was when we believed that the adoption of the Central Soma plan was imminent, and so the 2015 development assumptions were still more or less valid at that point. The next line shows in yellow what happens when we add 2017 assumptions. So we basically have escalated our costs as well as our revenues by 2 years from 2015 to 2017. We were unable to escalate it all the way to 2018 because we can't look into the future to understand what 2018 average rents will be. But just to kind of orient you to this, this first column is showing the Tier A and Tier B properties. So these are referring to the Central Soma fee tiers that show how much of an upzoning a property is getting. And this next column is Tier C, which are the properties that are getting the highest level of upzoning. So we see that when we go to the 2017 assumptions, both of the projects that were shown to be feasible in 2015 are now kind of in that marginal feasibility. And then the next two lines show when we add First, the $5 fee increase that was introduced by Supervisor Peskin, and then second, the $2 more moderate increase that has been proposed. So when we look at the $5 increase, we see that the Tier A and Tier B property becomes infeasible, whereas the Tier C property kind of remains in that marginal level, and then the same is still true for the $2 increase.
Supervisor Peskin, did you have a question?
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the focus on Central Soma, but let me ask you this as a threshold question. Given the history and the Nexus study and the feasibility study, outside of the Central Soma, what is your analysis, conclusion, and recommendation relative to my proposal for a $5 increase?
Sure. With the TSF, our financial analysis looked at two prototypes, one in what we were calling East Soma, but essentially it's very similar to the Central Soma prototype, and then another one in Transit Center, which was a much higher rise building, about 400 feet high. And we were using a different methodology, so that's why it's hard to compare apples to oranges, because in that case we weren't looking at an upzoning, we were only looking at what's the impact on land value if we add higher levels of a fee. So in that case, we were hoping to add a certain amount of TSF and not change the land value by more than 10%. So we have done a very preliminary analysis that looks at what would happen if we added the $5 as was proposed, and I can pull that up. So when we first escalate the assumptions to 2017 and then add the fee, we see that in Eastern Soma, the land value is changed by 9%, and then in the Transit Center, it's changed by 12%, which does exceed that 10% threshold that we had set.
Thank you. Any comment about my observations relative to Jones Lang LaSalle's different projections for different city agencies?
I'm happy to look into that. I don't have those assumptions with me, but I can definitely look into that and get back to you. I'm not sure if we're looking perhaps at different years. We weren't able to escalate it all the way to present day because we don't know the rent for the full 2018.
Yeah, no, it's a backwards looking business.
Yes.
Can we go to the next page, if
Sure.
that's okay? To the Central Soma projects, because I do have some questions here.
This page right here? Okay.
Going through the projects. And actually, I'll just start with my questions, because I think that they're somewhat self-explanatory. So it was good to get a sense of this, which buildings are in Tier C versus A and B, where you say that it may not be feasible for A and B. And I noticed that a number of those projects are hotel projects. This is, of course, anecdotal, and it's not based on any type of data crunching that I've done, but we have been hearing a little bit more from the developer community that they're moving to hotels because they feel that that is a more profitable project, partially given our expectations of them around affordable housing and other fees. Yet these are the projects that you state would not be able to absorb an increase in transportation fees. I have to tell you, overall, I've been looking at our jobs housing linkage fee in relation to hotels primarily because I am concerned that developers are going to be incentivized to move towards hotels and not from building office and from residential. And so I'm curious as to how, in the calculations you've determined that this increase in transit impact fees would not be feasible for hotel projects.
Okay.
Given, on balance with all of the fees.
Sure. So I think I should make a major caveat, which is the way that we run our financial feasibility analysis is that we choose, a number of prototypes that we say kind of represent the typical range of development that we expect in an area. And so in this case, we had one office prototype and then two residential prototypes for Central Soma. We didn't actually look at hotel, and so I can't make any comment on how this fee proposal would impact the feasibility of hotel. And then kind of another assumption embedded into that is that, with our prototypes, we're looking at kind of reasonable averages for everything, whether that's rents or construction costs, et cetera. And so every project is going to be different. And so on this list of projects that we've presented to the board, even though we're showing that some of the prototypes are in tier A and B and some are in tier C, we're actually not making any comment on the feasibility of those individual projects, as those are, subject to all of the particular agreements that those developers have with their contractors.
So when you state in the previous page that it is not feasible for tier A and B projects to absorb either a $2 or $5 increase, it's an imperfect science in many ways.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely an art and a science.
Okay. I think that's helpful in helping us examine the TSF proposal before us. Thank you.
Thank you. And I also want to jump to, I think, another spreadsheet that was sent over. I mean, because I do want to applaud Supervisor Peskin. I know he is trying to lead a huge undertaking in terms of finding more transportation dollars. And so I definitely do not fault him for that. I think we all support him in that endeavor. But I wanted to know how much money we're going to be generating from whether it's a $5 increase, a $2 increase, whether if all the projects in a particular tier would not be feasible, how much that would result in, because if it's a small amount, which I am seeing on the spreadsheet that it might be, I want the public to know kind of what we're talking about here in terms of the revenue we're expecting.
Sure. So if I could get the overhead again. So what we projected, so we took basically all of the projects that we know of for non-residential over 100,000 square feet in our pipeline, and then we also, through our planning department land use allocation, looked at future capacity, so basically properties that are zoned for large non-residential projects. And then we used that to calculate how much we project a $5 increase would raise. So that's what's in this orange box you see. So we believe that there would be, in today's dollars, approximately $26.5 million raised by the $5 increase. When you kind of break that down in terms of plan area, however, we see that about 88% of that, or 23.3 million, is in Central Soma, and then the remainder, which is about 3.2 million, would be in other area plans or elsewhere in the city. So that's the $5 increase. So if the $2 increase were substituted for Central Soma, essentially it would mean that the Central Soma value would be 40% of what you see here. So I think it's about $12 million. Whereas my understanding is that the proposal is to keep the $5 for the rest of the areas, so it would stay at 3.2 million.
Okay, thank you very much. Colleagues, any other questions, comments? Any other staff you wanted to hear from? No? Sarah Jones, so I see you wanting to come up? No? Okay. Supervisor Peskin?
No, I would only say that Central Soma has been in the pipeline for a long, long time. So I think it's important for all of us to note that in 2015, when the fiscal feasibility and nexus studies were completed, while Central Soma was not fully baked and is still not fully baked, it was something that was being contemplated. So I just think that we should all be cognizant of that, as was the child care fee. The board chose to pass that. The mayor chose to veto it. The board did not succeed in overriding the mayor's veto. But this is something that anybody who's been involved in Central Soma planning, where you just heard over $25 million could be realized. And short of that, I mean, colleagues, when we are dealing with Central Soma, let us be clear, which is the impacts, which are 3 times the amount of residential development, will be felt all over the city. So the nut that I'm trying to crack, I mean, this is not about trying to make developments infeasible. It's about trying to address the impacts that these developments cause. So in the last item, when we're trying to hold the MTA accountable, why is it? Because we're frustrated, because our constituents are frustrated. How could they not be frustrated? If we had enough resource and we recaptured enough value from these projects to actually address and mitigate the impact of these projects. And yes, that makes developers unhappy because they will realize less profits. And yes, I absolutely do believe at a certain point you make projects fiscally unfeasible. But as I said, our job is not to leave any money on the table so that we actually have a city that has equitable transportation, public transportation for all of our constituents. So why should we vote for a Central Soma plan that only makes the situation worse when we're not recapturing enough value? And with that, I will yield the floor.
Okay. All right. Well, seeing no other comments at this moment, then we'll go to public comment on item 2. Any members of the public who wish to speak, please come on up.
You probably already know this, but I'll just point it out that originally the Muni was originally privately owned by the developers, and they literally paid for the entire system at one time.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Josie Ahrens, and I'm the senior community organizer at Walk San Francisco. On behalf of Walk SF and our members, I would like to express our strong support for increasing the transportation sustainability fee. Walk SF supported establishing the TSF in 2016 because it was expected to capture funds to support our transportation needs to not only maintain but also expand our system as the city grows. At the time, we advocated for a higher TSF rate because we wanted to make sure that new development paid the true cost of its impact on our transportation system. Fast forward 2 years, and the current TSF, which was already too low to start, has not generated as much funding as we thought it would, and we still have billions of dollars of unmet needs. An increase in TSF will be used to support San Francisco's Vision Zero goals by providing significant safety improvements to streets, sidewalks, and intersections. An increase in TSF would also allow us to invest in a public mass transit system that will be the backbone of our city. Mass transit should be supplemented by emerging mobilities like TNCs and scooters, and not the other way around. And the way to ensure that that happens is by funding mass transit. Transit riders are pedestrians, and vice versa. We can't keep missing opportunities to fund our billions of dollars of unmet transportation needs. Walk SF is pleased to support this item to help the city achieve its Vision Zero, Transit First, Mode Shift, Public Health, and Sustainability goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Hello, Chair Tang and committee members. I'm Karen Babbitt, a volunteer with the Sierra Club, and by way of explanation, I'm filling in for a traveling Howard Strassner and an injured Sue Vaughn, so not an expert in this. I will say, though, that preparing for this, I want to make sure that Sierra Club was on record as supporting this, and sure enough, there's a letter from us in September of 2015, so this has been going on for a while. Dear Chair Cohen at the time, the Sierra Club urges the San Francisco Board of Supervisors to adopt a transportation sustainability fee matrix that makes large commercial projects and all market rate housing, which I realize is not on the table today, projects pay for their full share of transit and transportation related impact fees. So because we didn't have a meeting about this recently, I can't weigh in on some of the details that have gone on today, but I would say that we've been on record saying we need more money for sustainable transit since 2015, last time this was going around. We would appreciate the help getting some more money sent that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Bob Allen, Urban Habitat, one of the members of the San Francisco Transportation Justice Coalition and Mayor's Task Force. I think speakers have made the case for the need. The task force made the case for that need, $100 million annually. We've got the shadow of SB1 repeal, and we have an opportunity to get some down payment on that need. Looking at the study and the Nexus fee, 30,000 jobs over the assumed growth. Even with the increase of $5, we're still only about 25% of what the study showed in terms of the additional growth. And I think it's a little bit perplexing for those of us who understand there are many needs in the city, and whenever we come in terms of transportation, Either they're around things the task force identified that we don't have control over, that this body doesn't have control over. This is actually something you do have control over. And the idea and the kind of political boogeyman that we're going to stop development, I don't see any analytical basis for that. And I don't see how this fee is going to do anything but capture the legitimate impacts of this intense downtown commercial development that are being felt throughout the city. I think Walk SF spoke really clearly about the alternative we could have if we start to fund things. If this body can take action on revenue that you actually can control and that can intersect with the impacts of the intense development that we're facing through commercial development in the city, I'm not really sure when we're going to do that. Other cities, Seattle, even Los Angeles, other places are starting to take a little bit more control over raising revenue, but also getting control over surface transportation and right-of-way for public transit. We're not doing that in this city. We're walking away. And I think ultimately what will stop development is if the city grinds to a halt. It's not the issue that gets the most attention, but it's one of the issues that makes the city functional, equitable, and actually work. And if we miss this opportunity, we don't have another one in our back pockets. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is J.R. Epler. I'm president of the Potrero Boosters Neighborhood Association, here to speak in favor of the increase to the TSF. I'm approaching this from a neighborhood perspective. The Eastern Neighborhoods Plan, the regime that has governed the upzoning of Potrero Hill and Dogpatch, saw its fees, impact fees, reduced to 1/3 of what was identified in the Nexus reports that accompanied the neighborhood plan. While this has achieved a growing, vibrant, and increasingly dense mixed-use neighborhood, it has also achieved an underinvestment of infrastructure. The neighborhood associations have been able to work around that, getting private developers to help us fund certain needs. Things like parks and streetscape we've been quite successful with. Transit, much less so. One of the reasons is that developers see their funding of transit to have a much less local impact, particularly when something like a private shuttle can be more direct and can be marketed as an amenity to the development. So what we have an acute need for is additional public transit. And while we've been able to win studies to help identify our transit need, the issue that we're concerned most about is operating budget. The TSF is a good means of helping identify this gap in what we need for transit because it provides a direct nexus to the drivers of that need. Even if most of the funds come out of the Central Market or Central SOMA plan, that plan is going to drive a lot of transit need, particularly for those surrounding neighborhoods. And what isn't drawn from the Central SOMA plan is citywide resources for what is a citywide transportation network. I had the pleasure of serving on the 2045 task force, and what we identified was the need for a mix of funding sources for transportation over the next several decades. And this, while it's not a silver bullet to solve our needs, is a down payment, a start to addressing our most pressing transportation needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, and any others, please line on up.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Peter Strauss on the board of the San Francisco Transit Riders. As mostly a transportation guy, I hear a lot, that the city's top priorities are homelessness and housing, but transportation needs to be a priority too. This is not a matter of what's number one and what's number two and what's number three or number four. We need to pursue transportation equally along at the same time. And housing and transportation are hopelessly interconnected. That is why our Transportation Justice Coalition includes housing advocates as well as transportation advocates and others. This is very holistic. We all participated in good faith in the city's Transportation 2045 task force, and as you've heard, as you know, recommended a funding program for $100 million a year based on the Prop J plan. But our preferred funding source, as Supervisor Peskin explained, was the commercial gross receipts tax, which is now being used as a source for two other measures going on the June ballot. And as such, we need to look at the other funding sources that are available to us, some of which may end up on the ballot and some of which are under the control of the board. And this is one of those that's under the control of the board. We urge you to support this very strongly, as a down payment on meeting our overall transportation needs. The transportation impact development fee was mentioned at the beginning. When that was originally imposed, it collected 50% of the Nexus fees, the Nexus cost as part of that fee. Even with the increase, this is within 25%. We strongly urge you to support this program. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker.
Calvin Welch, speaking for Human Services Network and Council of Community Housing Organizations, both of whom were members of the Task Force 2045 Task Force. We're both speaking in support of the increase in fee. I want to try to make a couple of points. Can I have the overhead? This is from the original 2015 Transit Sustainability Fee Nexus. It assumed 5,320 jobs created in the non-residential sector every year for the period that they looked at the sustainability fee. The planning department, however, in 2015 points out that we're doing really well. We're producing, in the period 2010 to 2014, 30,000 jobs a year in basically downtown San Francisco. We want to talk about sustainability. The sustainability of this city requires a massive public investment in public transit. The answer in the original study was a fee. The Nexus study justified non-residential fee for non-residential development, not counting PDR, was $80.68 a square foot. We passed $19.04, and now we're talking about maybe raising that to $22. What is unsustainable is not funding a transit system that works for all San Franciscans. It is not sustainable for this political body to say that the only way we can pay for transit is a sales tax. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon again, Chair Tang and Supervisors. Brian Wiedenmeyer, Executive Director, San Francisco Bicycle Coalition, and I am here today to speak in favor of a transportation sustainability fee. As other speakers and as Supervisor Peskin have pointed out, our unfunded needs for transportation capital and operating currently grow into the billions. And we do not have, at this moment, a clearly identified source of funding to address those needs. If not this, then what? I look to members of this board to take our needs seriously, to act within their powers to address them, and to come up with some reasonable proposals to help fund our many and growing transportation needs. And to me and to our coalition of folks that you've also heard from, a transportation sustainability fee seems like one piece of the puzzle to help address that. It is troubling to me that we, after going through a lengthy process, many others mentioned the Transportation 2045 Task Force, that we left that process with a plan, and we still have no identified path forward to fund the needs that are contained in that plan. So I would urge you to support this, and I would furthermore urge this body to think very carefully about the impacts of a potential repeal of the gasoline tax in Senate Bill 1. It could be that in a year's time from now, we find ourselves sitting here talking about cuts rather than raising revenue. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon again, Supervisors. I'm Alice Rogers, and this time I'm speaking for myself. Our neighborhood association hasn't had time to consider the details of this matter, and we will likely like to weigh in later. As an individual, though, living here for 25 years, would like to thank you for bringing this issue up again. The initial transportation sustainability fee was way too little. And now we're looking at too little and also too late. Retrofitting infrastructure is an impossibly difficult task, and it's no wonder that the citizens are up in arms about MTA. I wish that you could join us monthly when our baseball Mission Bay Ballpark Transportation Committee meets just last week. We're looking at so many retrofitted improvement projects and not enough roads to reroute traffic that there is simply no place to go. So the net effect is really going to be, if you do nothing, development will stop anyway because you can't get anywhere or do anything. If you do too much, too much is still too late. I hope that you find the high level of that sweet spot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other members of the public who wish to comment on item 2? Please come on up. Okay, seeing none, public comment is closed. Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I hope the committee will see fit to adopt the amendments that I have before you. And then I also wanted to afford the representative from the SFMTA the opportunity to address this item in the committee.
Ms. Jones?
Yes. Thank you very much, Sarah Jones, Planning Director at SFMTA. I'm not going to cover all of the points I have, although I'm here and some additional people are here to answer detailed questions as well about funding, but I did want to add some detail around what the funds are for, how they're used, and also the overall funding gap that we have around transportation. So the T2030 task force, which was a precursor to the T2045 task force that we've been discussing, that group was convened in 2013 and recognized that there are 3 sources of transportation system improvement need. There's the core needs, which are basically keeping what we already have in good shape and operating well. The enhanced needs, which are looking at better serving San Francisco as it was in 2013, and then expansion, which is growing the system to meet expected needs in the future. And that last piece, expand, is what the TSF is about. So a lot of the gap and the needs that we have are just about dealing what our current system entails, but the expand is a very key piece of it. And so, as was mentioned, the tool at the time was the Transit Impact Development Fee, TIDF, but really that was not capturing all of the impacts of development. So if you don't mind going to the overhead. This is a very hasty table that I would have gotten an F on in 6th grade math because I didn't identify sources or units. But basically, the TIDF did not capture residential development at all. And it had, a little over $7 a square foot on production, distribution, and repair, and between, 12 and somewhere short of 15 for commercial, that is office and retail development. There's a lot of categories in here, but this is collapsed pretty significantly. So in 2015, as has been mentioned and referred to a lot, multi-agency working group did a nexus study to assess the level of impact of new development on the transportation system, as well as the feasibility study. So the nexus for residential development, you can see in the middle column, and then that compares to what was adopted based on feasibility. The feasibility study primarily focused on how the fee would affect residential development, being very mindful of a view towards not increasing housing costs. So in terms of what has come to MTA and also gone to regional agencies since that time, we have received about $6.5 million in TSF funds since the fee was established. There was a lot of grandfathering built in at the time and also a lot of development that's subject to other agreements. And so the pure TSF has been about $6.5 million, which has been pretty much aligned with what was expected. And we are budgeting for more over time time, looking at pretty much doubling that next year, $6.5 million just for the next fiscal year. And then for years beyond, around $8 to $10 million based on the projections that MTA has been given from the planning department. And these funds are allocated according to a citywide memorandum of understanding, and they go to transit service expansion and reliability, transit capital, regional improvements, and complete streets. So we've used the capital portion for efforts such as transit signal priority, which allow buses to move through the streets faster. And I only raise this because in contrast to the types of transportation improvements that get directly funded by development projects, which are really about improvements that are clearly connected to and benefiting the project, TSF is something that we can use on the system overall to make the whole system work better citywide. It's a citywide fee that is really looking at citywide impacts. All of the parts of how transportation works in one location are very much connected to what's happening in another location, and this fee gives us the ability to look at that. So what we're looking at for future uses of these funds are some critical projects like the 16th Street Improvement Project, Upper Market Street safety improvements, again, more signal prioritization, and near-term implementation of efforts underway like the Bayview Community-Based Transportation Plan. So we've already talked a little bit about what the proposed increase would do, which brings me to the need for transportation funding. As has been mentioned, T2045 was working from a starting point of $22 billion in need. The transportation sustainability fee was recognized throughout that process of not necessarily a source of a large amount of revenue, but it was valued for policy reasons and for reasons of equity. And so the task force's focus ended up being on the higher revenue generating sources, but a very strong coalition of task force members, many of whom you've heard from today, supported the TSF increase as part of an overall package for those reasons. And so again, as has been mentioned, we're in a place where a lot of the revenue sources are under debate or uncertain. We do have Regional Measure 3 on the ballot, which is great, but the other thing that's coming up on a ballot is repeal of Senate Bill 1. I can't emphasize how big of an issue that is. That $22 billion in need that was identified assumed that SB 1 was in place. So we would be further in the hole if that is successful, and we're definitely hoping and going to be working towards it not being a successful repeal. And then again, the gross receipts tax, of course, there's a lot of competing consideration around that revenue. So we are fighting the fight and want to keep the discussion open on all aspects of transportation funding. And I just want to close with both a reminder and a message of urgency. The reminder is that in order to keep this city running, it has been recognized at all levels that we now need to have a goal of 80% of all trips being by sustainable modes by the year 2030. So reaching that goal is going to take a lot of investment and a lot of hard trade-offs. And then the urgency I just want to close with is about this need for transportation funding. I cannot emphasize enough that we cannot have an equitable or economically healthy city without dealing with our transportation needs. And land use planning needs to be supported by transportation. This city that we're all envisioning together is going to need a far more robust system to support it than what we're able to provide for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jones, for that run through. Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, colleagues, and thank you to Ms. Jones for that, I think, startlingly important testimony. I realize that I submitted a amendment which I asked previously that a committee member make, but I would respectfully like to ask you to consider changing that amendment a little bit. Which is if a member of this committee would like to duplicate the file and accept the Central SOMA in its entirety, which we can then trail till after the commission hears this, and I realize that that is where the bulk of the value is, and move forward with the $5 fee, particularly in light of what Ms. Jones showed relative to Nexus and described as the history. So if we can isolate Central Soma, so I would ask that one of you, if you see fit, duplicate the file, and I guess I can't duplicate the file, Mr. Givner, because I'm not on the committee anymore. So take out of the title, the long title at line 5, where the fee for such projects would be increased by $2. So just except in the Central Soma plan area, and then we would make the corresponding change, presumably in the table at page 3, and remove the Central Soma and take that up subsequently. So at least we can show the people of San Francisco that while we have been, while they said no to a sales tax, while we decided that we would not move forward a commercial gross receipts office rent tax, which would have had an absolute nexus to downtown office building owners and their tenants, because virtually 2/3 of our public transportation infrastructure goes to, through, or from the downtown core. That at least we can get something done here today. So I will leave you with that. But at some point, we have got to find a dedicated source of revenue. And that point was several years ago.
Thank you, Supervisor Peskin. Before we act on your suggestions, it's really not lost on me how much money we'll always continue to need for transportation, and how we really need to link land use with transportation funding as well. However, one question that I have, and the points I'll make really stem back to our 2016 conversation on this very topic, and some of the points that were made at the meeting where we considered a $2 increase back then was that, through TSF, it was the first time that we extended the impact fees to residential projects. Through TSF, we've increased the fees for commercial developments. And so when I look at the analysis that was presented to us, it shows that with a $5 increase, we would generate potentially about $26.4 million of additional revenue. But if you take out all the Central Soma projects, then that means it would only be about $3.2 million. So correct me if I'm wrong, but this is just based on the spreadsheet and our conversation earlier. So I just don't want us to think that by passing this, we're actually generating hundreds of millions of dollars for transportation. It might just be $3 million. So again, I hear the principles I agree with, but the additional amount of revenue might just be 3.2. Supervisor Kim?
Supervisor Peskin. And
Supervisor
then I'll speak
Peskin?
after him.
So I don't want to disagree with our experts who have posited those respective numbers of $26 million and change and $3 million and change. But I do want to put it in, and I also do want to acknowledge that when we change the transit impact development fee into the TSF, that we did something that was pretty amazing, which was that we captured residential development. And I think that is very, very important. And as Ms. Jones said, made a very conscious decision to not burden residential development with additional fees. And I'm not actually arguing any of that here. Had we raised the TSF for office, whether it was by $2 or $5, with Central Soma, without Central Soma, back in the day, we would have captured projects like the Salesforce Tower, which would have still been built, which would still be occupied, and would have actually mitigated some of the impacts that it had. But we didn't do that. So I'm not arguing that $3 million is less than $26 million, but I am arguing that sending a message that we're willing to put our laws where our needs and our mouth is very important. And so that's why I really asked for the divided question. I do not want to send any message to the people of San Francisco that we have solved our transportation woes with an anemic $3 million, but I do want to send a message that we're totally serious about this and will tackle Central Soma in an appropriate, fiscally feasible way in the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. And I think that my other point is that the majority of the projects that were analyzed and potentially would be impacted by these increases are in the Central Soma. So I understand we're trying to potentially carve it out. However, what we're left with is just such a small amount of projects. And so, again, only bringing in $3.2 million in additional funds. I don't know what kind of a message we're really sending, because if we do want to send a message, it would probably be to incorporate all of the projects, even Central Soma. And I also do think it's really important that we make that clear distinction between what was in a nexus study versus what's in a feasibility study, because I think sometimes we tend to conflate them. And so we think that just because the nexus study justifies a certain dollar amount, that is what projects should be able to do. Supervisor Kim?
Just a couple of things that I'll note. While I think the number might be disappointing, it's still $3 million, and I do think it's important that we right-size the impact transit fees, regardless of what it generates, because I don't know if the message is the right way to frame this, but it is important that developers do pay their fair share of the impact that they're having with building and construction, and we want to make sure that they are contributing to our transit infrastructure. And so I have always thought that this was the right fee. It was what I supported 2 years ago, just because it doesn't generate, millions and millions of dollars, more than $3 million, I don't think is a reason that we should not move forward with this. I feel comfortable with that. I do appreciate Supervisor Peskin duplicating the file and letting us discuss the appropriate fee for TSF for the Central Soma plan, because it's not just about transit. Within the Central Soma plan, we have higher expectations for developers' contribution to affordable housing and open space, and also Mello-Roos and maintenance of many of the new infrastructure that we plan on building within the Central Soma plan. So for me, it's not about should we raise TSF. Of course we should raise TSF, but in balance with the other asks that we're asking of developers, I just want to make sure that we have a right balance in terms of what we're asking them to contribute to housing or transportation, because I do think that we're asking for a lot, and I think that's a good thing. But I just want to make sure that we examine the new fee increase on balance with our other asks of developers in the Central Soma plan. So I would support Supervisor Peskin. So at the appropriate time, I'll make the motion to duplicate the file and to make the amendment to move forward. I do think it's tremendously important that we do this. I just want to say there are times that I will negotiate and fight over even 1 or 2 or 3 additional affordable housing units, and sometimes the criticism that I'll get is that, oh, that's only 1 or 2 or 3 more units, that's not really meaningful. But I just have to say, when you meet that family or that household that moves into that 1 or 2 or 3 extra units that we moved into, it is very meaningful in the lives of those individuals. And I know that fees and units are not always the same things, but I do think that we should be doing what we can to more greatly contribute to our transit infrastructure, because we're certainly not doing enough today.
Thank you. And just to confirm with Supervisor Peskin, you're still proposing the $5 increase for all the non-Central Soma projects. Is that correct?
That is correct, and
Okay.
well below the nexus and still significantly below the 2015 feasibility.
Thank you. And I know that Supervisor Kim mentioned earlier that she supported the fee previously, but I think the previous one that Supervisor Avalos had recommended was actually just a $2 increase. So I just want to make that clear that that was what was voted on in 2016 that was vetoed. Supervisor Safai?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Appreciate it. I guess there's a lot of good things. I'm glad we've decided to have further analysis of Central Soma, since it's 88% of the proposed fee that would be impacted by this proposal. I do think that what I heard from the planning department is that They hadn't really done a full analysis of what $5 would be outside of Central Soma. They've looked at, and they said it was not apples to oranges. I appreciate the spirit with which Supervisor Peskin's trying to move forward something that makes a strong statement. I do think development projects absolutely should be the value that they're imposing on the overall city, and the impact that they're making is tremendous. I think that when you talk about, we had this conversation with the Transportation Authority this morning. A lot of the projects in Central Soma, for example, still allow for a certain level of parking. People do drive in from all over the Bay Area to those offices and offices downtown, and have a significant impact on San Francisco in a way that's different from residential projects where people have multiple forms of choice to access their jobs. So I think there's a lot more conversation that needs to be had before we would split the file and move a conversation forward in terms of what would be done outside of Central Soma. I'm glad that we're slowing down the conversation because Central Soma is imminent. There's going to be a lot of discussion both in land use and in multiple committees and at the planning department. And I think I heard the planning department say that they were at fault for not scheduling and having this conversation sooner than we are now, but we are where we are, and these conversations are going to move forward. So I would probably hold off on doing anything outside of Central Soma or in Central Soma until we have further analysis from the planning department and have them say to us what the actual impact of what a $5 fee or a $2 fee or whatever the fee might be outside of Central Soma. So I probably would not support that motion today.
Supervisor Peskin.
And I do respectfully, through the chair, to Supervisor Safai, want to posit that if you believe that all of these projects should pay for their impacts, we should not be having a conversation over $5, but we should be having a conversation as set forth in the nexus as displayed by Ms. Jones, upwards of like $80. So, and I do, and I'm happy if Mr. Ram, you want to speak, but I do want to say that when you raise a fee, that becomes the conversation that inevitably in 5 or 10 years later becomes the baseline to the next conversation about raising fees. And I was, when I was first on the board in 2001 and we experienced that post 9/11 economic downturn, we reevaluated literally scores, dozens and dozens of fees that hadn't been raised, from you name it, marriage fees to parking fees, et cetera. That was back before we gave Ms. Jones the ability to, or her commission, to raise parking fees and what have you, fines. And that became the baseline for another decade. And so, having these conversations are never easy, and I get it. Developers are in business presumably to make money and return money to their investors, and that's all well and fine. It provides jobs and in some cases housing that some of us can afford. But it's time to bite the bullet, brothers and sisters on the Board of Supervisors, or then let's stop playing the games of this other tax and that other tax, because if you want this city to function, it's got to have a transportation system that works. And if you don't want me to be your SFCTA chair, that's fine, but that is our collective responsibility, is to crack that $100 million nut.
Thank you, Supervisor Peskin, and I don't disagree with you. I applaud you for how you're trying to rein us all in and make sure we're addressing our transportation needs. Again, I just want to be super realistic here that it's $3.2 million we're talking about with this particular piece of legislation, especially if we do duplicate and separate out the file.
And not to be argumentative, but that $3.2 million, which presumably, if the numbers are right, represents about a tenth of the projects, isn't going to kill any developments outside of Central Soma. So why not pass it?
Do we know that for a fact?
Well, let's see what Mr. Ram says.
Anyway, Director Ram.
Thank you for letting me comment again. I think, as Lisa said, the metric we used is a little different, is the effect on land value, which is a standard procedural thing we use, and we think it pushes the limit pretty closely. But I think you can make an argument that outside of Central Soma it may be more feasible. I think they can say that much. I just wanted to remind the committee that the Central Soma, the Tier A and B projects, the ones that are the lesser of the intensity, if you will, will, in addition to TSF, pay $21 in a Central Soma transportation fee and other fees, so that the total that they would pay is about $60, just shy of $60 a square foot. The Tier C projects will participate in the Mello-Roos, which is where the $500 million in transit improvement money comes from. So just a reminder, we forgot to mention that earlier. I just wanted to make sure you got. So we're actually a little bit closer to the nexus than what we have been talking about.
In Central Soma.
In Central Soma, yes.
Correct.
Fair
Yeah,
enough.
no, I'm not arguing that. As a matter of fact, hats off to you. Had we captured, value recaptured as much outside of Central Soma over the last many decades, we'd be having an entirely different conversation, which is why I initially, through the chair, offered the $5 down to $2 for Central Soma. But we can easily capture outside of Central Soma $5. I thought it was an anemic first ask.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Supervisor Kim?
I just also have to say that Supervisor Peskin did first introduce this in the beginning of February, and over the course of 3.5 months, I've not heard from a single developer complaining about this proposal. And not to say that that's indicative of whether this pencils out, but I certainly imagine that if that is not the case, that we will hear from them in due course, and certainly during the project approval. And as someone who wants to make sure that projects get approved and pencil out, I think that we can re-examine the fee or work with the project sponsor in specific instances if they feel that this is the reason why their project is not going to pencil out, that we will be able to work with them on it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a motion to duplicate the file and to then read into the record the amendments that Supervisor Peskin has put in. So one file, I guess, excluding any changes to the Central Soma plan. I imagine we would have to put in affirmative language, City Attorney Givner, to ensure that the $5 increase excludes projects within the Central Soma plan to one file, and then to continue the existing amended file to the call of the chair.
Yes, the Supervisor Peskin's amendments that he distributed basically have two different categories. There's all non-residential except for areas in the Central Soma plan are set at $5, and the Central Soma area is set at a $2 increase. So we would just be basically wiping out the $2 increase and leaving the language that says we're going up to $5 for all non-residential except in the Central Soma plan area.
Okay. Thank you. And I believe that is non-debatable, correct? The duplication of the file. Okay. Supervisor Peskin?
Oh.
I mean, sorry, Supervisor Safai.
I was going to say, yes, that is not, debatable.
The duplication of the file isn't, but I did make a motion to amend the one that I will then make a motion to move out of Land Use Committee with recommendation. So
Yes.
I have duplicated the file. One I will leave within committee to the call of the chair, but on a separate motion, I'm now going to make the motion to amend the first file as stated by Supervisor Aaron Peskin.
Okay, can we do that without objection on the amendment?
On the amendment?
Yes. Okay, we'll do that without objection.
And now I'd like to make a motion to move forward the first file to the full board with positive recommendation.
Okay, do we need a roll call?
Yes.
Okay, roll call vote, please.
On the motion stated by Supervisor Peskin, Member Safai?
No.
We took the amendment already.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Without
on the motion
opposition.
to refer to the full board?
With recommendation.
This would be, just to clarify, this is the item that does not contain Central Soma.
And just the fee, the $5
The $5 increase, that's correct.
Right. On the motion as stated, Member Safai?
No.
Safai, no. Supervisor Kim?
Aye.
Kim, aye. Chair Tang?
No.
No. There are 2 noes with Supervisor Safai and Tang in dissent. The motion fails.
Okay, so I mean, with that said, I do want to continue this overall conversation. I want us to, my goal is not to have this dying committee. I want us to continue all of it, both the duplicated and the amended file, I guess either to the call of the chair or May 21st, whatever you prefer, because I do know that TSF will be heard in it'll be heard at Planning Commission on May 17th, and Central Soma will be heard on Planning Commission at May 10th, and then back here on June 25th. So I'm open to when you'd like to continue this. Supervisor Peskin?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it was actually to that specific issue that I wanted to speak, which is insofar as a matter of charter law, the Planning Commission has lost jurisdiction over this matter, and insofar as I have no intention of introducing a resolution to extend their time to review it, I don't have to wait for Mr. Starr or Planning Department staff to send us a report. We will listen to what they have to say on the 17th, and it would be great if we could take this up again on the 21st. So with all respect to Supervisor Kim, I would prefer if it could be continued to a date certain on the 21st.
So originally I meant the second duplicated file would be continued to call the chair, but if the first file has not moved forward, then I would also like to continue this to May 21st.
Okay.
I just
Supervisor
have a
Safai?
point of clarification. So it will be heard at planning on the 17th, and then Central Soma is coming to planning when?
May 10th.
May 10th.
And then it will come to the full board.
It'll come to land use on June 25th.
And then it has to go to land use and rules. I think there's 2 committees it has to go to, from my understanding. Anyway, I know that for a fact. So the order of that, but that, Supervisor, that doesn't impact the conversation from your perspective.
We'll have the benefit of Planning Department and Planning Commission deliberations on both items by the 21st.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay, so with that said, Deputy City Attorney.
Can I just
Kibner?
one housekeeping question? So you now have 2 files, one with the $5 increase for the non-Central Soma plan area, one for a $5 increase and a $2 increase for Central Soma. Is the committee's intention to continue both of those files, or to rescind and just keep the one file alive and deal with that one at your next meeting?
As a matter of housekeeping, I think it would be fine, and thank you, Supervisor Kim, through the chair, for duplicating the file if we killed the $5 file and move forward with the $5, $2 file and deal with it on the 21st.
Wait, which one is
Okay, so sorry, to clarify then.
We're just keeping the original.
Just the original. Okay.
The original as amended.
Okay, original as amended. So if we can get a motion to rescind that motion for duplication of the file.
So moved.
Okay, can we do that without objection? Okay. And then we will, so now we have one version again, and that one, do we have to make another amendment to that version, or is it already done?
It's done.
Okay, great. So we will, can we have a motion to continue that item to May 21st?
So I'll make a motion to continue this item to Monday, May 21st.
Okay, we'll do that without objection. Okay, thank you very much, Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you,
staff.
colleagues.
Okay, now, Madam Clerk, if you could please call item 3.
Item number 3 is a hearing to provide a report regarding the implementation and execution of the community benefit agreements.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim.
Thank you. I have called this hearing so we could hear from our Central Market Tenderloin Citizens Advisory Committee regarding the community benefits agreement called for under the Central Market and Tenderloin area payroll expense tax exclusion. For anyone that is unfamiliar with these agreements, they are a unique feature in which there is a contract between the companies participating in this payroll exclusion and the city. No other tax exclusion that the city provides, such as stock option tax exclusion, includes a feature that requires companies that partake in this benefit to give back tangibly to the community and to work with a CAC in order to structure that agreement together. I also believe that it is worth noting that since the Board of Supervisors did not have the authority to approve these contracts, we were unable to delegate that authority to the CAC originally. I certainly would have supported that, but I do want to take the time to appreciate the CAC for their work and advising and relationship building over the last 7 years. We are now in the 7th year of this 8-year program, which started in mid-2011. The CAC first met on September 2011 with this, and the tax exclusion sunsetting next year in 2019. The report today is a way to provide the CAC members to present an overview of the benefits that are provided to the community, recommendations on the board on issues and needs currently confronting our neighborhoods and being addressed by these community benefit agreements, as well as their insight into the pros and cons of the community benefits agreement. As this program ends over the next year, I think it's good for us to review what has gone well, what could have been improved if this board and city ever does consider taking up a program or incentive like this again. I also want to recognize Sam Dennison, who chairs the CAC, who has already approached the mic. I believe that soon we will be joined by Bill Barnes from the city administrator's office, who staffed the CAC. And unless my committee members have any comments, which I do not see any, I'd like to go ahead and start with Ms. Dennison. Before you start, I just want to say a heartfelt thank you so much for the hours of work and energy that you put into the CAC. It is a volunteer job. We do not provide any benefits for the time that you spent in both herding a lot of cats, getting people to meetings, to get quorum, negotiating with agreements on behalf of the community, and spending time listening to the neighborhood and community in terms of what the many needs are. Your ability to listen thoughtfully, to bring people together in a very divisive climate, and to engage effectively and collaboratively, bringing both community resident stakeholders as well as companies, has resulted, I believe, in tangible impacts for the Tenderloin and Central Market neighborhoods. And so I just want to thank you for all of your efforts. It is not easy to do. So I just wanted to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. And if we can have the slideshow up, I wasn't quite sure how to get it all the way into its slideshowy position, but
SFGov TV?
Yeah. So what I want to say first off is that it certainly has been a difficult process. In the early days, it was very contentious, and we still have moments of contention. The makeup of the committee started at 11 members with designated seats, and then we had 3 more. About a year ago, we ended up with 5 people on the committee unable to fill the other seats, and the Board of Supervisors passed legislation to bring the number of seats down to 5. And now we have 4 members, and 1 more member has informed me they're intending to drop. And I just want to point out that the 3 members who remain are the 3 stalwart residents of the Tenderloin. Every member who was appointed with an expertise or a particular desire to extract particular interests out have sort of fallen by the wayside as time has gone on. So I want to applaud the members of our community who have really hung in there. The big thing that I would say that we have done is we've managed to keep good relationships with all the companies that we've been working with. Let me just give you...
You can speak at that.
Oh, can I speak at this one? Okay. So this year's community benefits, we have 2 new community benefit companies, Lever and PAE, which is Portland Architect and Engineering. We have continuing CBAs with the Fitness SF, Spotify, and Zoosk, and then we have multi-year agreements that we don't vote on with Twitter and Microsoft, which was formerly Yammer. Out of all of these, there are literally hundreds of thousands of dollars of grants, volunteer hours, and in-kind donations. And you can certainly look up our records to see what the content of that is. I'm going to say that I think what the 2 things that we've really been able to accomplish with this committee, especially in this last year, is ensuring that the level of give back to the community has been higher than it would be had it been under ordinary circumstances and these were corporations doing sort of ordinary levels of corporate give back or corporate responsibility. Having said that, I also don't think we had sufficient, as Supervisor Kim said, teeth to really be able to enforce this in some ways. One of the suggestions that's come up from the community quite a bit is that part of the benefits should have been lumped into a common pool that then the CAC would be able to designate out, so that then there would be a real incentive both for other partners within the community to participate on the CAC, but also so there would be much more attention onto how we could leverage those dollars as a whole. what's happened over the years is that more and more dollars have become oriented towards small and specific favored projects, and certainly don't have the level of impact that we would hope that they would have otherwise. So having said all of that about where we have gotten to so far, I want to talk about the one real accomplishment that we've had this year, which is, in the beginning, we really talked with the corporations about finding ways to leverage the power of crowdsourcing, of networking, of being able to bring in additional dollars to the common good, to be able to look at things like small site acquisition funds, housing subsidies for people within the neighborhood, various ways that we could pool resources and do substantial good for the common good. That never gained traction for a variety of reasons, one of which being that there simply was more interest in kind of gaining patronization rather than being able to do the common, leveraging common good. So what we were able to do, though, this year, because we had these two new companies, Lever and PAE, and we had in the room parents from the Tenderloin and mid-market area public schools, we started a conversation about how we could increase funding for the public schools. And one of the first signs that we had of great success around that was when, at the beginning of the year, the Reading School needed additional dollars for a literacy expert. All the CBA companies gathered together and they raised over $40,000 to ensure that that literacy expert remained at the Reading School, and that an additional $20,000 went to Bessie Carmichael and to the Tenderloin Community School. That success has fueled a process where the CBA companies are now collaborating with the parents of the mid-market public schools, and they are looking to build a strategic plan that may raise us between $500,000 and $1 million a year over the next 3 years to support the schools in our neighborhood. And the reason this is so important is that schools in other neighborhoods that often have wealthier families and resources, when they suffer cuts, they are often able to raise $300,000 to $500,000 without too much effort. When the parents of our schools go to raise funds, it's often $10,000, $20,000, or $15,000, and they can't compete and can't fill the needs that they have. So by bringing together a collaboration with the various CBA companies, we believe that we'll be able to create some momentum. And this is a way of creating resources for the schools that aren't dependent on the bottom line giving of the different CBA companies, but rather leveraging crowdsourcing and other ways to do the fundraising. So this is our great success for this year, and it's a model, I think, that could be used in other CAC circumstances in order to really look at how not only to take revenue from the bottom line of various companies that are receiving a benefit, but to leverage those resources and the energy of those companies so that a substantial good comes to the community. So that's my report for this year. That my hope is that by the time we get going a little bit further, we'll have more to be able to tell you.
Sam, I just want to, Ms. Dennison, I just want to say thank you so much for this report. It's actually really encouraging to read that you and the CAC have been able to work on getting more concrete and specific contributions, particularly also to our local economy as well as our local schools. We do want the prosperity of these companies to extend to the neighborhood, and I think it was frustrating initially when our small businesses were not benefiting from new employees and new companies coming to this commercial corridor that used to have the highest commercial vacancy rate in the city. And so getting them to commit to specific percentages and numbers on local purchases commitment, I think really makes a big difference for the neighborhood that they are a part of now.
Yeah, and I just would add to that it has been so interesting over the years that with every company that has made the agreement to give specific dollars or specific percentages, the biggest difference has been being in front of the CAC and being asked to do that. Many of them would say, well, we brought our vendors with us from other locations, or we were looking to the larger city, but in this instance, we were able to generate more revenue for local businesses.
I just want to ask, what do you think has been the greatest impact of this process of negotiating this community benefits agreement, despite not having teeth, and for both the community and the companies?
I have some feedback from the CBA companies, and I'd like to read just a couple of those. Very often you wouldn't be surprised to hear something like this from a Twitter employee, that he was a technical operations manager who joined the Eviction Defense Collaborative and then became part of their board and has since then really become an advocate in the eviction defense area. He had done nothing around eviction before that, and then this has really opened his eyes. We also have people who will say things like, I can't tell you how much volunteering in the Tenderloin means to me. I feel very welcome when I walk around there. I really do good work that makes me feel good and makes the world a better place. But it's also worth it to, from Zendesk, and I reached out to the older companies as well, who says, we have learned that being present and engaged with our community members and stakeholders helps diffuse the perceptions and assumptions of those members about our intentions as a tech company in the neighborhood. We've been able to rehabilitate ourselves in the neighborhood. So, I mean, it's really helped to improve relationships in that way. But it has its limits as well. From Zoosk, we have, and unfortunately Zoosk is being priced out of the neighborhood and having to leave. So it's an interesting reflection that the real estate market is actually working against some of the companies that came in originally to take advantage of what's going on. But Zoosk says, I'm afraid to say that I'm not sure our engagements have changed our relationship with this neighborhood significantly. I hear frequent comments about stress of having our office in this location due to the little improvement in the safety conditions around our office and the frequent negative interactions our employees have with passing vagrants. And that's reflective of the kind of engagement burnout that we're seeing in the whole emphasis on volunteering. I've been to volunteer, people will say, and it doesn't get better. And I'll ask, how long have you been volunteering? 2 years. And we think, wow, some of us have been here for 20 and 30 years, and we're still, in the same struggle. But that's a key piece of it, is that relationship with people who are new to the neighborhood and trying to find a way that we can say, this is about the long haul. As new neighbors, you need to have the same commitment that we have here as well, and it's not going to be instantaneous. So this is the ongoing work that we have to do.
And what do you hope to achieve before the end of the tax exclusion program next year?
My greatest hope is that this public school project will allow us to build momentum towards a public good. Not only do I want us to be able to raise the kind of money that I think we can, the $500,000 to $1 million for our public schools, but I'd like the conversation to be able to shift to, for the employees of those companies, why do we have to raise this money privately? What's going on with the public school system that there aren't enough funds for these schools, for the schools in the rest of the city, and they start looking at things like Prop G and asking, how should I vote on that? What happens to our tax dollars? Even the materials that we were talking about here today, we've got to talk more about the common good as a matter of, I need to pay part of my wealth generation back into the community so we all have a quality of life. I think the CBA process can really help us do that. And if we can launch this particular project in an affirmative way, we may find that we can have those conversations with at least discrete groups of employees who are captured by this. And we may be able to extend that out to other things, like it is better to be on public transportation than on a private transportation, because you share the experience of the city with other people, and you're able to develop that empathy, because you will be able to reap the benefits of everything that we do as we pay into our community. So it's a grandiose scheme for a very small committee with very few people, but I think our work is paying off if we can get PAE and some of the others to be committed to the longer period, even after the sunset occurs.
Thank you so much. Do you mind naming the remaining members of the CAC so we acknowledge them?
Absolutely. My dear friend Steve Tennis, who works with Safe Passage and is just indefatigable for our neighborhood, and the ever reliable Antoinetta Stadelman, she is so reliable. Whenever I have the greatest fears about quorum, if I know that she's the one that will make quorum, I have no fear whatsoever. Someone who shows up every time and has shown up since the very beginning. And Steve as well.
Antonetta also served on our South of Market redevelopment CAC as well, which means that she's been attending many meetings for a very long time and being a very reliable quorum member for over a decade. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I do see that Mr. Barnes is here today, and I just want to give him an opportunity to speak if he would like. Seeing no presentation, wanted to open up for public comment on this item.
Yeah, my name's Otto Duffy. I've been involved with Central Market planning. We're segging from central south of Market to Market Street itself, and also to the north of Market, a slight refocusing. So it's a good segue. I've been involved with it a long time, from its high point in the 60s when Mayor Shelley was mayor, to its very, very long decline in the area, to the point where around the turn of the century, and Aaron mentioned the SARS thing, right about then, it had the highest vacant storefront rate in the entire city. And under that situation, two mayors and a lot of developers were really pushing to turn that area into a redevelopment area, which have been high cost, bloated, unbalanced, and a massive welfare program for overpaid, extraneous professional bureaucrats. And we really, really didn't want it. And I'd like to correct some ideas that I hear in progressive circles. What we came up with, this is the community came up with this idea for the tax break. And the reason it was because we were being faced with a redevelopment plan that we did not want and would not work for us. And it was the least worst option available. And one thing that everyone should know is this plan did not originate with Jane Kim. It came from the community. We came up with it. It was the least worst option available, and Jane was merely our aid in getting it passed. And it worked. It worked overnight. It was revitalized in 2 years, and my only issue is that probably for many years ago, it's not a net benefit to the city. It is not a net benefit to the city, and it probably should have been closed to new applicants years ago. And finally, I see that the Board of Supervisors is getting ready to close it to new applicants, and I'm glad that you have the power to do that finally. I also want to say I'm pleased that we have people like Sam Dennison in our neighborhood who can do the heavy lifting.
Thank you, Otto. Seeing no members of the public, through the chair, if we could close public comment.
We will close public comment. Thank you. All right, and that was a hearing. So Supervisor Kim, what would you like to do with the hearing?
I would like to make a motion to file this item. We do have a year and a half remaining on this payroll exclusion, and I think that it is worthy of our time to certainly examine and study what went well, what didn't, how we can improve this. It's a learning process as always, but I do want to thank Ms. Dennison and the entire CAC, including the members that started in 2011. This is not an easy task. We did not give you, we were not permitted or able to give the CAC more teeth. And so a lot of it was cajoling and relationship building and being creative and thoughtful. And I just want to appreciate that, because a lot of time and effort goes into that, and a lot of care. And really belief that we can strengthen our neighborhood together. So thank you so much. And so I'll make a motion to file this item.
Thank you, and thanks for everyone's hard work on this. So the hearing, we'll do that without objection, is filed. Okay, Madam Clerk, are there any other items before us today?
There's no further business.
Okay, our meeting is adjourned. Thank you.